Thanks for joining me to discuss the hidden hand of sex trafficking. I'll be sharing some of my insights on the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, released annually by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, also known as the UNODC, providing one of the most important studies into the true nature of this growing social problem known as human trafficking, sex trafficking, and modern enslavement. The Global Report on Trafficking in Persons provides new information on sex and human trafficking, overviews global trafficking patterns, legal steps taken to combat trafficking, country-specific information on victims, prosecution, and new government policy responses. But oddly enough, this is one of the least discussed sex crimes reports by the corporate media. Could it be due to the hidden hand of trafficking? Is that why they are so silent? The media, gender studies academics, Me Too orgs, law enforcement, and national governments and their controlling politicians have known since at least 2009 that in 1/3 to half of all nations examined, 33% to 60% of those perpetrating sex and human trafficking crimes are women. This hidden hand behind the trade is unknown to the vast majority of the public. See, when we are discussing global trafficking in persons, we have to be careful because the terminology can be somewhat misleading as it places too much emphasis on the transactional nature of the illicit trade. It's more accurately described as modern slavery, a trade, surprisingly, where women in many regions are the primary traffickers. Furthermore, what we learned from the UN report is that 80% of the victims are forced into sexual exploitation, while the remaining 20% are forced into labor bondage. Whereas many are more aware of sex trafficking, most in the West are unaware of labor bondage being as common as it is even in 2020, and this is across 155 nations. When we are discussing misandry, gender bias against men, and the sort of entitlement politics pushed by the fourth wave feminists, somehow this hidden female hand behind the whole sex trade receives very little attention from those who proclaim the loudest to be the strongest advocates for said victims of sex and human trafficking. Most in the corporate media, especially those that occupy the left woke identitarian camps, would find it very discomforting and counter to their patriarchal nemesis narrative to learn that women control the sex trafficking trade, even in the age of Me Too, believe all women propaganda. Yet, they mostly remain silent on the issue. Another data point that stood out to me was that women accounted for 60% of the sex and human trafficking convictions in Eastern Europe and Asia. At the same time, we learned that the recruitment stage of trafficking is dominated by women, again, as the primary drivers of the trade as procurers and madams. According to the UNDOC, the victims of trafficking can be women, men, boys, or girls, while 80% were adults, 20% were children. With 60% of traffickers being females, it challenges our belief that the woman's natural role as nurturer would stop her from conspiring in an illegal trade that harms her sex the most, especially those young girls. It makes sense that the mainstream media, fourth wave feminists, and the ivory tower apologists would attempt to censor the bombshells in the UN report, because by not talking about anti-male counter evidence from blue chip institutions like the United Nations, common people are left in a state of ignorance by strategic non-disclosure of the hidden hand of sex trafficking, and the media understands this. For many listeners to this upload, learning that in many nations, at least 60% of all sex and human traffickers are females, while the other 40% are males. At the same time, 70% of the victims are females, while the remaining are males. This is truly a paradigm-shattering revelation, and one has to just let it sink in. Through this thorough report from the United Nations, we also got an idea of the kind of industries that these victims of human trafficking were forced into. We learned that by industry, especially in regards to like the forced labor portion, it takes place in many different industries, but the most common were domestic work, construction, or agriculture at around 64%. The second largest industry was made up of victims forced into sexual exploitation at 19%. The next largest group of victims were those forced into hard labor by different governing authorities of the various 155 nations. This represented about 16%. So this sort of hard labor enslavement was fully state sanctioned where it happened. After much neglect and indifference by the mainstream media, the public is slowly waking up to the existence of modern day slavery. But why have the fourth wave misandrists been so silent to acknowledging and discussing publicly on different corporate media platforms like CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, etc., this topic? Or is it that this is just too taboo for the Me Too inquisitors and their proxies? To wrap up this discussion, I'll just state that the role of the female trafficker as the hidden hand of sex and human trafficking can no longer be ignored and overlooked. The corporate media may well continue to push anti-male propaganda for profits and control, but the more informed we are on the issues, the less effective they will be in hiding the truth from the masses.